Hi everybody, it's Coach Alex here at Peak Human Performance again, and today we're going to be sitting down and getting to know Coach Sarah. So Coach Sarah, how are you today?
I'm fine.
You're fine.
You talk really loud.
I do, yeah.
Do I need to talk loud?
No, it's all set up. You just have
right.
to just talk like normal. I naturally am loud. It's kind of like shifting gears. So I'm normally a little more introverted, but when you like start coaching and you start doing stuff like this, you gotta
get loud.
Pick up the volume just a little bit. Yeah, good. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it. So what I think is different for you, which is different from everybody else, is that you did not take the traditional path to becoming like a personal trainer, a strength coach, like a performance coach. So why don't we talk a little bit about kind of like your beginning. So let's start with like family, tell me about that.
I grew up in a family of, there was 5 girls and 2 small bathrooms. But that's not, that we would not have been a typical family full of girls. My parents really raised us, because back at that time, that was even before like Title IX, girls didn't have the opportunities in sports that they do now. My parents raised us to be able to do whatever the boys could do, whatever guys were doing. A lot of people would think of a family of girls as really touchy-feely, and just the opposite, really. And we were actually very competitive with each other, with other people outside of that. In sports, I think I was swimming competitively like when I was 4, because I had sisters, and back then you kind of did everything that your family was doing. So my sisters were a little older than me. We were 2 years apart, and they were swimming, so I was swimming. So I was the 4th out of 5, and there's a pretty big break between me and 8 years between me and my youngest sister. It was a different dynamic there, but there's always somebody better than you when you're 2 years younger. Whether it came down to swimming or tennis or your bank account, and each other's buttons to push too. So it was, and back then parenting was a little bit more hands off too. So, you were gonna, there wasn't a ref or a ump to settle things. Anyway, so I initially would have been swimming, and actually my dad would have swam in college, my sister swam in college, so we were all kind of on that swimming track. And then when the big tennis era hit, started to play tennis. I grew up, our house was right on a country club, which we were members, but this is a smaller town, so it's not like the country clubs that you think of nowadays.
Right.
It was a place to go play. We spent our time, learned how to golf and played tennis and swam all summer long. It was, a great opportunity in terms of, exposure to those sports. And really, if you think of my age, when I got my certification, NASM certification, I started to read the book. It talked about like the history of the fitness industry, and I thought, oh, that puts me right there. First with, the country club sports, and, then you moved into, like the Y thing.
The Y and the recreation.
The Y and the recreation kind of things, and, I would have done a little strength training there. And with tennis, like I got much more deep in tennis, probably because of the age that I was at. Martina Navratilova was, she and Chrissy Evert.
All the rage, yeah.
So at that point in time, too, is when cross-training, meaning like running and playing your sport, as well as nutrition being an edge, started to hit. So I was, in my teen years, and so I was reading that kind of stuff. Now, granted, the high-carb diet is now defunct, but I learned that, whether I was running outside of playing tennis, whether I was watching what I ate and trying to, there was an advantage to it.
Yeah.
And though I was athletic, you always needed an advantage. There's always somebody
looking for something,
better, so I was looking for those things. So it set me up, I think, really to be a learner in the just fitness, health and fitness in general, and it's been a way of life since then. So I played tennis in college, and again, there was that it's a little bit like my family dynamic where you are you're competing within the team for your spot on the team, and there's a big psychological part of that, but yet those are your friends. You travel, you spend so much time with those people.
Yeah, you get really close.
You get very close, and that was a phenomenal experience for me. I wouldn't have done it any different, even though it means that you aren't able to do other things. I went to school at Iowa State University in graphic design. Like I said, back then there was not. Exercise physiology was just starting to come into play at a master's level, but you were going to go work for a cardiologist.
Yeah, you're going to be in the hospital.
Yeah. So, that wasn't even thought of really as an option.
So, out of curiosity, when you say like you went to school for tennis, but you grew up swimming, and swimming was kind of like everybody in the household, how do you make that decision that you want to pursue tennis? Was it like bucking the system of the family and everybody's a swimmer, so I'm going to go do this? Or did you have a falling in love kind of like, what is that, a courting relationship with tennis where you dabbled a little bit and then you loved it a little more and then it was like, boom, this is what I want to do?
So again, family dynamics I think plays a big part of that. Like my oldest sister would have continued competitively swimming, but the rest of us, I think I dropped off. Actually, I broke my arm, and so I had to be out of water for a summer, and it was my left arm. So I was able to play more tennis, but literally the tennis courts, the swim pool, although we didn't compete at that pool, but we were lifeguards.
You compete anyway, yeah.
You compete, yeah. Like, I still remember the 4th of July underwater contest, of which I won numerous years, but also almost passed out when my sister was lifeguarding, and man, was she not happy with that. When you come up out of the water. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, plus because tennis was such a boom, and back then, parents were not driving their kids around. I'm sure part of our, being involved in tennis was...
Well, you had access to.
And coaching. I mean, I had equal access to golf. I would go up and do the Friday morning golf, lessons, and there was a time where I played some tournaments and took that a little bit more serious, but that takes a lot of time, and not as many of my friends were doing that. So I'm hanging out up there playing tennis. And I would say, too, a lot of the people even at that point in time that I was playing with were guys. Not to say that there weren't girls or even some of the women that I was playing with that were certainly as good as I was, but, to get better, that's what you're going to,
you got to play against somebody else.
You got to play, and it's who I was hanging out with, too. So I think it was probably easier for our family to... and at that point, my sister, 8 years younger than I, was born. So, she's in her younger years, was not like able to just go off on her own.
Right.
My mom didn't have the kind of flexibility to, and even when I started to play tournament tennis, I typically was going to those tennis tournaments by myself. I might be riding my bike if it was in town. When I turned 16, I was traveling on my own to tennis tournaments. My, parents were not necessarily there watching over, making sure, and it was a choice. Do you want to do it or not? They didn't care. It wasn't like, oh, you're good. Let's make sure you get every opportunity. But I also had a passion to be better. In hindsight, I can see I really like technical things. And so whether it's, even to now when I swim, working on technique and getting better via that, tennis, whether it's one of the things about strength training that I like is, because I used to not like strength training at all, I would do it to be better, but it was easier to drop off of. But when I started to do powerlifting, not that I'm a great powerlifter, but the technique part of that is what really, I enjoy that part.
Putting that stuff together,
yeah. And because I had, my oldest sister didn't really play tennis, but second oldest, and then the one 2 years ahead of me who I was competitive with, she was the one I always wanted to beat,
Yeah. Did you ever beat her?
Oh, well, I definitely beat her. So tennis is a big mental sport, and I would have been more of the mentally strong, but also at that point, like one of the lessons that I learned and had to learn was good sportsmanship and drawing in my emotions and being in control of that. And when we were in high school, so she would have been 2 years ahead of me. My mother was the tennis coach, which back then was a little bit more the administrative kind of thing. But my sister would have played the first seed, and so my goal was to be first seed.
Yeah.
And which put my mom, when I think back at it, it's like my poor mother. I put her in the worst position. So anyway, yes, I did. I took that first seed and was able to. Now, in hindsight, it's like, oh, there's all kinds of drawbacks. I mean, the same thing in college. You're the first seed. You are playing the best of every team. Yeah. You are going to lose more often. And losing, I saw this in college in particular. Whoever on our team was in the number one position, and our coach was smart enough to rotate us around the top 2-3 of us, because they could be mentally out for the not be able to win a match that they should win for the next 4 years if they came on as a freshman and played that spot and lost to the player that was brought over from Russia and the best player. So you learn different things. Like sometimes the things that you really want aren't always the best.
To have at that moment.
And so you're going to learn something else through that.
So 2 questions. One, so your mom has 5 girls.
Yeah, exhausted, but she.
Tiring. 5 kids in general. Do you think that, or have you ever had the conversation with her?
No disposable diapers back then either.
Yeah. What was her, like, for a normal, like, I guess not a normal mom, but for a mom, she would think, all right, I've got 5 girls, like, this is how life is going to be. And then she's got 5 girls that are competitive athletes, like, beating each other up, trying to get first place, racing each other down, like, coming home dirty, like, all these sorts of things. Do you think, was this like something that she was like, man, like, I really love this? Was she competitive and athletic as well, and she was pushing it? Or was she like, I have no idea what to do here?
Like, just a little background. My mother would have been the oldest of a family of 5. So back then, that was normal.
5 was normal.
5 was normal, not even like a lot, And we were I grew up in a Catholic family. I'm not Catholic anymore, but that was the norm. Everybody had a lot of kids.
Okay.
So, and she would have been the only girl out of a family of boys. So she
was familiar with that.
She was familiar with it, and she would have been the one that was pushing us as girls. I wouldn't have noticed it back then, but when I look back at it now, like with my younger sister, there was no baseball league, so you're gonna let my daughter play with the boys.
Oh yeah.
That kind of thing. She's not that kind of woman though, in terms of like back then a strong woman was
not
more
overt, it's subtle.
Yes, it's subtle.
Yeah.
And that's the way. And so, you don't really watch your mom that much, and you look back in hindsight and you see things, or you learn things, 30 years later, like, I didn't know you were doing that. Like, she was taking like an investment class or something sometime in there, so she had her own things. But she was also, playing tennis and in her tennis leagues and mixed doubles leagues, and it was a social part of life back then. I think she golfed once a week, so
she was like a unspoken role model for you guys, leading the way.
I don't know that we would have looked to her as that, but I do think that her quiet strength, like in our family, you didn't complain. It was more of a military kind of thing.
Yeah.
You were seen and not heard, and unfortunately, I was one that was usually making my voice known, which, my mother would say you were contrary, and I probably was, but I was also, not in control. I was learning how to control my emotions and how to. And some of the stories that my sisters tell are like, oh yeah, but my parents wouldn't have let on that, that I knew I was the difficult one. I would say that, but it's things were just different. Let's just put
Yeah.
it that way.
So question 2 then, it sounds like at a young age you had a lot of independence, like a lot of freedom.
Yeah.
How did that translate for you having to go away to college and then go from a home environment where everybody's around, you kind of have your freedom, but you know, like, it's like you can only go so far, like this is here, that's there, you know where everything's at, to now you've got freedom and you're in college and you were recruited and you're playing sports. Like how did that transition from the home life, off to college? Was that good? Was it bad? How was your experience going into your freshman year?
So first off, it was my goal to play college tennis, and
From an early age? Like what's the earliest you can remember?
You know, when I started to play tournaments, maybe 16, 17, you know, probably when my sisters were starting. My sister swam in college. There were a couple things I definitely wanted to. Everybody else in my family went to the University of Wisconsin, including my dad. They were and are Badger fans, and I do have a Badger side to me.
Okay.
But I was definitely going against the grain. I didn't want to go to the University of Wisconsin because they didn't have a degree program that. The closest thing to graphic design, which is what I got my degree in, was like journalism. And I would have gone there except for the fact that, you know, when we were, you know, at a college fair, I think my mother realized when we talked to the Iowa State University and their design program and we, you know, visited University of Wisconsin and the rest of that was where I was going to need to go. So from there it was, and back then because the Title IX wasn't in effect yet, they did not have equality in scholarship money. So there was much less money on the women's side. So for me, and they were typically recruiting out of Chicago. Not Wisconsin, just because there's just more competition at that point. So when I went as a walk-on. So that in and of itself, my freshman year, because you've got to make the lineup, and they don't necessarily want you to beat those that are on scholarship and they're paying money for. And for me, because it was out of state, which, you know, I knew that it was more money than what my parents were spending for in-state tuition. So there was a lot more pressure. I put a lot of pressure on myself to succeed. And as a result of that, that fall when we were doing, like, I could play phenomenally, but when it came time to do challenge matches, I was a head case. And could not win a challenge match. I could beat people in practice but when it came down to those challenge matches, and so I knew going into, we were gonna, you know, reboot in the main season back then was in the spring, and so you were going to challenge to see where your position was, and if you were not in the top 8, you were not traveling. So to me that would have been devastating, but you know, it was a point in my life that I had to be able to let go of what I really wanted to be able to get what I really wanted. And it was really my faith at that point and my own personal relationship with Jesus that put me in the place to say, whatever is best for me, I will accept.
You're good with whatever.
And having that mindset when I was playing challenge matches allowed me to be freed up from the
stress or fear
the
of not being able to perform.
Yeah. And I had always played out of really loving, but then at that point, and I think that is the best place to come at any sport, is not out of fear. I have to do this to be able to, you know, make money or be on a team or be liked or to be in the social crowd I want to be or whatever. Or because my parents have invested a ton of money in me and now I've got, you know, I had friends that were like that. You know, they went to tennis camps and lived at tennis camps, and the pressure on them, they didn't make it through high school tennis because, you know, they had to be good because it was expected. You know, I was going to beat you because you just were down at that camp, you know, and the target is on you. So when there's that kind of pressure, especially, you know, kids are only so mature. So for me, that was a big, getting beyond that and being able to win challenge matches, um, and just accept what came. I was going to do my best. I practiced, more than other people. In the winter, I would be practicing with, the coach, if he would, in early mornings with the, in the gym with that kind of stuff to try to. There were some really talented people on that, and I knew too. Part of what got me where I wasn't that I was super talented. It was that I was driven.
Yeah, you were just
and
working
I
hard.
would work hard.
Yeah.
But in the end, if you don't have that mental edge, all the work in the world
It's not going to help.
It's not going to help.
So you go to school, to the School of Design,
Mm-hmm.
and how did you get from there to eventually starting a career as a coach? How do you go full circle from being the athlete, transitioning out, and then coming back to it as like a coach? How did that happen?
So, when I was in college, I also, and in the back of my mind, I thought I was going to be a tennis pro. Not a playing pro, but a teaching pro.
Teaching pro.
And I worked for a number of summers as a tennis pro. I worked for a place called WTS, and they would place coaches all over. So I was in Minnesota, I was in Erie, Pennsylvania for a couple of different summers, and had exposure to, when I was in Erie, I was working with someone that was the tennis coach at San Luis Obispo, California. So just, you kind of see things in a different way and you rub shoulders with different people. But through that experience and at that time, and I don't think I had really the maturity level, I, really decided I am going to follow my graphic design career. So I did, but the desire for me to just keep training in different areas. So when I was out in Erie, Pennsylvania, triathlons were just, starting up. And some of the people where I was, they were into triathlons. And they were like, oh, you should try a triathlon, So at the end of one of the summers, I did a triathlon and really liked that. And I had already been running and, swimming just in terms of training. So adding the bike was not a big deal. But, then I go back to Iowa for school, and there was nothing in terms of triathlon.
Yeah.
So in the back of my mind, I, wanted to get into triathlon. So, but to get back to your question, there was always something really physically driving me to train. And I was also always much more into the technical side of things and really reading and picking apart that side of things. And along the way, when we moved here, I got much more involved in triathlons and did that for a decade. And, raced at a high level, was able to go to Worlds one year up in Edmonton. That was phenomenal. And really I dropped off tennis. When we moved here, I did not play anymore.
You were done.
I was done. You get burned out, and you can only do so many things so well.
Yeah.
So people say, oh, why don't you play tennis anymore? Why don't you do triathlons anymore? Why don't you why don't you swim anymore? I do. I still will use it for training in its place, but yeah, I can only do so much, you know,
yeah.
and especially when you have kids and a family, even, you got to pick and choose what you do.
So, graphic design to coaching.
Yeah.
You dabbled a little bit in coaching, but you spent most of your time. Sounds like there was like a transition period where your focal point was on kind of maintaining your career, but shifting focus to family, your family life.
Yes.
And then at some point, you kind of watched the industry evolve around you, in commonality, people saying like, hey, are you a trainer, or do you do this? And eventually it was like, I like these things, people gravitate towards me, and now at some point you have to have established some free time in your family life. So you decided to start coaching. Like, how did that work?
So, Not exactly like that, but and I don't think I was really watching the industry, but somewhere in there, because I was doing, like, the idea that you can do everything is just not the truth. And I developed adrenal fatigue.
Doing too much?
Yes, doing too much, not sleeping, doing endurance, events, training that way, and that really put me back.
Now, how did you find out that you were in adrenal fatigue?
So, and that's a good question, because back then that was like, doctors would laugh at that, and they will still somewhat say, oh, you either have Cushing's or you've got Addison's, there's no such thing. But there was obviously something wrong. One, I lost my passion. I was still doing things as hard, but I decided I'm going to take off a summer from racing. I continued to train, but depression, sleep issues, just extreme irritability, things got to where I was really not functioning. And at that point, and a regular MD would go, oh, well, you're just used to doing more than what most people can do. That's where I got off the track of your regular medical professional, and started to find answers outside of that, things that were not necessarily covered under insurance. And so there's saliva tests that you can take to see where your cortisol levels are. My circadian rhythm was totally flipped, and then really it wasn't just flipped, but it was very depressed. So I was not even really producing the amount of cortisol. So that translates over into all the other hormones too. So you're not going to be happy if you don't have, dopamine functioning. You are,
So what phase of your life did you find all of this out?
So my kids, my son would have been probably going into about first grade. So it would have been prior to that I was really experiencing, some of those things. So first, second, third grade in there.
And how old would he have been at that age?
So my kids
probably
are 2
like
years
7 or 8?
apart. Yeah. And I'm trying to think. So he was I'm trying to remember if he was in first or third grade, but one of my kids was. But again, it's pretty slow. You don't just go from, there's different levels of fatigue. Some where your thyroid's taking, control, and there's just a lot in that cycle. A lot of variation of it, and as I came out of it and was always testing along the way, I could see where things were starting to pick back up. And
now, were you testing yourself, or was this something you were working with your doctor?
Yeah, I was working with a doctor, working with a couple different, and having to really work with a number of, from a naturopath to, I found different realms of, to help along the way. And without that, I don't know that, that I would have gotten out of that. And during that time, I literally, my husband really stepped in and helped out with the kids, and I was happy. It was so bad. I was just happy if I could read to them at night. For me to be able to, around that 3 o'clock time when they would get home from school, be able to sit down and help them with homework, that was not happening. I could not think clearly. I could not, mental fog, the ability to concentrate, not there.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's interesting because in this day and age, especially with me now becoming a parent, I see and read a lot about postpartum depression and all that sort of stuff. Do you feel like that was the category where people kind of just said, oh, well, you're a mom and you got all this sort of stuff and you'll get through it, or you could tell, you knew something was off, and it was much longer than the traditional postpartum kind of sequence? So
people wouldn't have necessarily, postpartum depression was not a huge known thing then.
Got it.
And so I think I was probably not really built up to be a parent in terms of somewhat of a perfectionist, which you don't have control over your kids.
Yeah.
You can train them as much as you want, but trying to do everything very goal oriented. when you are raising your kids at home, it is one of the hardest things to do if you're not working outside of home. So yes, I was, had my own business, but my interaction with people was a lot through email, a lot through. So other than the people that I trained with, which were mostly guys, to me it wasn't like, oh, something is wrong. It's a slow decline, and I think I had more of the mentality of something is wrong with me. I need to work harder to get over this. I just need to be happy. Not this idea I'm just a negative person and I just need to stop it and be, versus understanding that there's all kinds of hormones that go behind that. And so, and back, there wasn't a lot of, you wouldn't hear podcasts or see things written.
You had to venture out and go acquire
and
this
so when
information.
when I found those practitioners that were like, oh yes, and they were treating other people with that and not pretending like it's not a real thing. They knew, that it was what to look for, how to handle it, what the process was, and also the realization that as long as you have kids, you might struggle with this. Like your adrenals will potentially be taxed, and you may have some damage that it's not going to come back. And you may have inherited part of this from your mother who had 5 kids and was probably exhausted. How you are when you're pregnant. And unfortunately, I probably passed some of that on to my kids. My kids, I have them at the naturopath, I have them in alternative medicine, and they would, like my son will tend to have, low adrenals if he doesn't watch it. So it's through supplements, through understanding, he's above it, and, but that it's a constant,
learning curve about themselves.
About themselves, and being, open to that versus just the stress I'm on. This is just natural. I think you see sometimes the pressure today of things turning that way, and what's happening is it's hitting people a lot earlier. The 24/7, you were the hero if you could be 20. There's still people that live that way. Students are still that way.
Living that way.
And what you see is a much higher rate of depression,
dropout.
You see a lot more suicide. And so anyway. So I ended up dropping my business and stopping because my health was so bad. And but my kids are obviously growing. They grow super fast, and they were my focus, but I knew they were also going to be out of the house, you know? And so then where do you go with life after that? And, and there was a period in there just where I had some pretty deep depression due to adrenal issues and, probably my outlook as well. Things are always intertwined. There's never a one. Just getting to that point was my goal initially. But then, as you get closer to that, it's like, well, what am I going to do? And it's the things in your past that lead you to, and just like I didn't want to play tennis anymore, I got burned out on that. I was burned out on design. It was, to have a great project was no longer like, who cares? I can knock out and, so.
You were ready to move on.
I was ready to move on, and the question was what? And at that point, I had feedback from people that, and I also started to, because with adrenal fatigue, one of the things that even now will show me when I'm starting to have weak adrenals is I get injured, like ligament tendon injuries pop up. Like, I wouldn't do anything. How can this be? Like, and then it'll take,
long time.
And so, though I was in triathlons, and there's very much a mentality of like
fight through the pain.
And somebody who's weak would work with a trainer. Like somebody who doesn't have motivation would use it. And there came a point where it's like, I'm gonna start work with a trainer just to get through these injuries, because I just keep injuring. I would push, and I needed somebody to pull me back, but allow me to continue to grow in areas. And so that was one of the things that got me over really looking down. Actually, I was working with Gabe at that point. So instead of looking down at personal trainers as like the people that you only go to a personal trainer if you need accountability and you can't do,
Yeah.
you don't have the motivation on your own. To really seeing the advantage of it, because not only was it helping me get through injury to where I wasn't constantly injured, I was feeling stronger in ways that I wouldn't have. And I was lifting on my own outside of that and doing, different like core classes and yoga. I did a lot of yoga during that period. So I think that's what kind of opened my eyes instead of being like, judgmental against that whole thing.
Yeah.
But people would say, one, I had the side of friends that were like, oh, you'll just be working with overweight people. You don't want to do that. That's like, And then there was the side of people, and the people that I helped that were, wanting to start something, wanting to get out of the hole, and just sometimes even just through emails, giving them little tips, giving them some direction on where to go, what, and just the joy that brings, I think, is. But for me, I also had somewhat of a mental, like, I'm too old to start.
So you created a block for yourself.
Yeah, like I knew I didn't necessarily have to go back and get a degree to do it, but I felt like the people want to work with young people, and I don't blame them. Young people have an amount of energy and idealism and all kinds of things that are phenomenal.
But I think the one thing that you say, like, young people have the energy, but I see, like, you have a level of experience and background and wisdom that I feel like young athletes need, that they need to see, and sometimes they don't get that working with somebody who's 20 years old, so I think that there are amazing trade-offs in both directions, and I think it has everything to do with, like, the athlete and what they need to get out of it.